Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Denes Boros and this is the Games of the Week. Now, we've got plenty of interesting endgames that happened this event, so I actually kind of wanted to focus on the ones with these upcoming superstars. Now, there was the game between Harikrishna and Donchenko. They weren't exactly the top of the field, but was a very interesting endgame, and if we have exactly, we might just check that out as well. But I want to start out first with this game between Wojtaszek and Esipenko. Let's take a look. We are going to start off, we're not very interested in the opening, but from somewhere around here, bishop a6, a4, c6, it kind of starts from an opening where Esipenko surprises his opponent and goes straight into a position where white is rather underdeveloped. Now this will be sort of a mix between a bit of an endgame and middle game. So it's not like per se an endgame position. That'll be mostly the Firouzja game, and we're going to focus a bit more on that one. But here, c6, knight a3, takes knight d7. Actually, black gets some very good play, as white's pieces are sort of scattered all around the board. Well, in fact, mostly just staying back in the garage. So in this game between Wojtaszek and Esipenko, Wojtaszek is struggling. Whenever you have this big dilemma of what to do, you always come up with the thought of, castling would be great. However, castling is not at all an option because it'll take 1, 2, 3, and 4 moves to castle. Now, there is one certain Magnus Carlsen who used to say that castling is important, of course, but he says that if it takes 3 moves, it's tough. If it takes 4 moves, however, that's an issue. Knight e2, rook b8. Pressing because he knows that in general, that is what black is trying to do. He's pressing on b2, and he is trying to take advantage of the fact that king on e1 is still stuck. Rook a2, castles, knight c3, queen a5, bishop e2. So this is actually an important position, and I want to ask you guys what you think would be the best way to continue. We already know that the king is likely to make it to the other side of the board. However, we still have the momentum as black. What would be an interesting way of continuing? So the big issue is, of course, that white is really behind. There is this move, rook d8, and there is this idea of c5. If you thought about that, you are on point. And this is what Esipenko is going for. He is trying to break it open. Okay, now queen c2 happens, c5. So notice that Esipenko is very good with initiative. That was actually very well known and seen in his game versus Magnus Carlsen, which he famously won, as I believe most of you know. And here he does the same thing. He takes control. Castles, c takes d4, bishop d4, knight c5. Now, white managed to castle. However, the pieces over there are still very much scattered and they're not enjoying their presence. Like in the future, the knight actually is headed towards d3. And even though there's a c4 pawn weakness, the knight is going to be quite strong over there. Knight b5. And here Esipenko actually comes up with a brilliant, brilliant idea that is sort of unbelievable. And then we sort of get into the endgame phase. So here, actually, black has a beautiful move. Let's try to find it. We are going to get towards the endgame, chat, so I know this is indeed not an endgame yet. For that, I apologize, but that's what we're going for. So bishop takes b5 would run into ideas such as bishop takes c5. Not that it's necessarily a bad move, but it doesn't take a big advantage of the momentum. Because if bishop b5, there is this move of bishop c5, and white is more or less okay with those two bishops. This is fine. So it turns out that there is this spectacular idea of rook takes d4, knight takes d4, knight b3. And this is really unheard of. It seems like what is going on? Black is just losing material out of nowhere. But it turns out not to be the case. It turns out that this king is so unfortunate on g1. There are these queen c5 ideas, and you will run into those. Normally, knight c6 would be the bully move, kind of double attacking the queen and rook. But there is this queen c5 check, taking the knight and just chasing that king away. So knight b3, again, there's really no way of stopping this. If you go queen c3, there is queen c5. And this pin is the most annoying because there's e5, black gets the two pieces, and with passive pieces such as rook on a2 and bishop on e2, it is black who is definitely dominating. No, this move actually, honestly, shocked me when I saw it myself. I couldn't believe my eyes that this is working, but it does. Knight b5, that's the only move. But now we have bishop takes b5. It takes b5, and then that rook is dropping. Bishop takes c4. And here black has the funniest of moves you can think of, but it works. And in chess, if it works, it really just does work. There's no questioning a good move. So what was that funny move that Esipenko played here? It feels like in this middle game, very close to the end game, black is in trouble, but not so. Really not so. Black is able to do a Houdini. If knight d4, there is this move of queen c3 winning that knight. So that doesn't really work as well. So believe it or not, Esipenko played knight a1, with the knight on a1 getting stuck over there and just not enjoying its existence. But an extra piece is an extra piece. It's not something you see all the time. Queen c3, queen a4, and now naturally we tend to want to win these knights on a1, but it turns out not to be that useful and not that great. The big move here that Wojtaszek I think is understandably missed is rook b1, which is just an unbelievable move. The knight can't escape and b3 is coming. And this would have sort of leveled the game. But for someone to find rook b1, you have to be a magician or at least Michal Tal. This is not something you can do. b3 is the human reaction, but that sort of gets into the endgame that we wanted to talk about. Queen takes b3, queen takes b3, rook takes b5, and here we have to decide in what way we are going to play. Black definitely, of course, has the extra pawn, but that is not a guarantee you're going to win it. So our opponent has a wide squared bishop, and that sort of begs the question, how should Black continue on? Where should Black put his pieces? And just a disclaimer, here White did play rook c1. Obviously we can't capture because we would get back-ranked. So here we have to decide where to put our pawns, and with that, how to continue and devise a plan. Dark squares. So what would be the ideal formation for Black? First instinct, move the king. Okay, both of them make sense. Bringing in the king makes a lot of sense. And also putting pawns on the dark squares makes sense, especially with this bishop on the other kind of color. Rook b8 does feel a little bit passive, and I would avoid that if it's not necessary. So here actually Esipenko played g5. So if you had the idea of putting a pawn on the dark squares, you were correct. There are all those squares under control, which is very, very important. Grab some space, and also there is some hope of rotating the knight around with knight d7, knight e5, sort of consolidating. Rook c3, king g7. Notice that Esipenko is in no hurry. He is up a pawn, he has a great position, but he doesn't want to show his ideas just yet. He doesn't want to commit with pushing that a pawn, because the more you push that pawn, the easier target it may become. King f2. So once we decided to put some pawns on dark squares, what would be our second plan? We already had and already decided to put a pawn on g5, but what would be another way of continuing? The pass pawn really can go. That's a good point, Exquisite. Although there is some potential with that pawn. I guess we need idea to have weaknesses on both sides. That is correct. So just having an extra pawn, probably an extra pawn should still be winning. But the more weaknesses you get in your opponent's camp, the more likely you're going to win. Yes, so simply push the pawn up to h5 and h4. h6 is flexible, however is not as energetic as pushing it up to this square. What could be the point of getting that pawn to h4? Well, the point is to fix those pawns and potentially create an extra target. I mean, h6 makes sense, but probably is just not as aggressive. And Esipenko is more of like this Karpov school of chess, solid yet classically aggressive. King e3, h4. Fixing those pawns and putting them on dark squares, so this bishop can never reach it. So A, we put our pawns on dark squares. B, our king is safe. It's surrounded by all those pawns and knights, so there's no real way of coming close to it. So here comes question number 2. What would be the ideal spot for this knight, for this knight on f6, that is? How about g4? g4 makes sense, but that might be committing your ideas a little bit early. Reroute the knight? Yep, that's a great idea. The question is just where, Ragnarok? It definitely could go to e5. Is there any other appos that we can go to? So this is one way of getting there. Of course, there are some problems, but that's not necessarily, it's still an idea, even if it doesn't work right now. f4, yes. So there are a couple of plans that black can do. One of them is to get this knight to e5, and the other one is to go to f4. And honestly, I kind of prefer f4 because it directly presses down the g2 pawn, and you can also reroute it if they chase you away with knight g6 and knight e5. Now, definitely you can go for the knight g8, knight e7, this plan, but it just takes a bit more time. This is just 2 moves, and the quicker you can get to your destination, the better. g3, sort of anticipating that maneuver. And again, he goes h3, and these are those little moves that have so much sting to them. Of course, this can become a weakness, but it does fix that h2 pawn, which will become a target. Bishop d1, sort of going that direction, but now he goes rook b2. And now you can see the hidden idea of pushing this h-pawn all up to h3. It's sort of fixed there, and now you have a great position. Not just the a-pawn, but the h-pawn. So you've got those 2 weaknesses on the one side and the other side, and that should be enough for a win. Bishop e2, g4. And g4 makes a lot of sense. He is actually trying to break through the last barricade, and if he can get close to that pawn, you're just winning. F takes, knight takes c4. Of course, you can't take because check here and rook h2. Rook a3, knight g5, rook takes, check. And suddenly, we did lose that pawn on this side of the board, but there are just too many weaknesses on the king side, and that's enough for Esipenko to mop up the game. Goes king d4, rook b1, going over there and picking up the h2 pawn, and with white's pieces all scattered around the board, this is just losing. King e3, here, rook a5, king f6, over defending. Again, notice that everything that Esipenko does is solid. Everything's defended. That rook is undefended, that is true, but there's really no way you can attack it right now. Bishop f3 takes rook a1, rook b2, and it might seem premature to resign here, but really there's not much white can do. This is just completely losing. So this was the first game I wanted to show from Esipenko versus Wojtaszek. The second game, we're going to start from the middle. So let's start from here, this position. Bishop e7. This game is between Alireza Firouzja versus Anton Guijarro David. A very typical position, not saying that anyone is really better here, but probably it's just easier to play with white. So we're going to watch and see how Firouzja slowly but surely outplays his young rival. Queen b6, rook b1. So he played king f1, queen b6, rook b1, queen b5, takes, takes. So black gets an endgame, but it comes at a cost. At the cost of those two pawns being doubled and potentially very weak. Now, in endgames, the value of weaknesses sort of rise. And if you can fix them, you should. So here actually, Firouzja's next move is very, very important, and that one is a3. He controls that square, so there's no b forever coming close. And with that, this will become a chronic weakness that black will have to deal with. Not that white can attack it right now, but endgames are all about long-term targets, and that b5 pawn is one. h5, just fixing this side of the board, not letting Firouzja go h4, h5. But of course he couldn't go h5 now because of b4. a3, h5. And that kind of makes some non-forcing positions forcing. So a3 was logical, and he just was a tempo short of expanding on the other side. Knight b3. So one of the big questions is, where is this knight really going to? And if you are familiar with some of these reversed Carlsbad structures, you'd know where this knight is headed. Yeah, I mean, these super talented kids already know how to deal and play these lines. They know that if they have a weakness, they need to put pressure on them. So the idea of knight b3 is not really to go to b3. It is a start of a maneuver getting this knight towards d3. And if you can get the knight to d3, it'll be super useful. f6, but he first goes to rook e1, pressing that pawn on e6, making sure there are no breaks, because there are just too many white pieces guarding the all-important e5 square, and now he goes for this maneuver of knight c1, knight d3. King f1, knight c1. Very purposeful play by Alireza, and this is actually one of those things that sort of distinguishes them from the other grandmasters. They're very purposeful, and they are bent on following through with their plans. Knight f8, knight d3. So the thing what you see right now is maneuvering from both sides, but it does seem that Firouzja is a little bit more successful. Now f6 is not necessarily bad here. It's not the best. You don't want to play f6 if you don't have to, but it does control the e5 square, and if Anton, Guijarro, David could get e5 in, he would be more or less okay. But he's never going to get it. Knight g6, bishop g3, knight a5. So whenever you look at these positions, you always wonder, okay, I've got a knight on d3. That's great. We've got our bishop over there, knight over here. These are all great things. We've got the rook on the open file. But chess is about things that don't work. And in this position, there are a couple of things that don't work. That king on f1 is just not ideal. And Firouzja sort of realizes, well then, let's improve it. So he goes on for a small walk towards h2. Knight c4, rook e2, rook e8, king h2. So Firouzja was brave enough to take his time to get there, get to h2 and involve this rook on h1. So he actually not just improved the king that was sort of in the way in f1, but he also improves this rook on h1 and puts even more pressure on this square, not to mention the e6 square. Bishop f8, rook e1. But again, you might be asking, so what? What happened? What is the difference? No big difference just yet, but Firouzja is getting more and more of a grip on what's happening. b6, king g1. b6 is a nice defensive move, by the way, by Anton Guijarro. He's just making sure there is no knight c5. But does that change the dynamic of the game? Not really. It's still the same dynamic. White is in cruise control, owning that square, and just having a better position. In fact, notice that this knight that moved from d2, c1 to d3 is actually over defending the b2 pawn. Shouldn't black trade the dark squared bishop? It's actually not a bad idea. Probably something that Anton Guijarro should have considered. Because if you have less space, exchanging just make a lot of sense. Yeah, white does have infinite time. Rook a8, bishop f4, rook c8. And when I was younger, I also thought that you have the luxury of just moving back and forth, but it really turns out that it's not going to help you. By the way, black couldn't take on f4, because then Firouzja would have threats on h5 and e6, so that's just not worth it. Now, it's not that waiting is necessarily a bad way of playing chess, but it doesn't improve your position, and if your opponent finds a plan, that'll be just very detrimental. g3. So for the moment, it's kind of clear. We don't have a way to break through on the queen side. Neither for black, neither for white, even though we'd love to win that b-pawn. So the only way we could play is on the king side. Rook c6, king g2. Sort of preparing some maneuvering and maybe potential f3, g4 ideas. Bishop e7, knight g1. So he's trying to get this knight to h3 out of the way so he can start promoting and pushing those pawns. Why move the king from h2? Well, one of the things could be to avoid exchanging the bishop, but I don't think that was the main idea. The main idea really was just to maneuver around, as black really doesn't have anything to do, and just get the knight over there. Knight g1, bishop f8, knight h3. Bishop e7, knight g1, bishop f8, knight f3. And you might be asking, rightfully so, what are these moves? Like, why is Alireza just repeating? Well, they're on move 33, and this was an over-the-board tournament, so they were in no rush of showing their intentions. Also, the closer they get to move 40, the more likely they're going to be playing this position with more time. So I guess Alireza didn't feel like actually show his hands early on. He's just kind of maneuvering and waiting. Bishop e7, and now he goes king h3, just making 100% sure that there's no repetition. Rook a8, bishop c1. Moving the bishop away, potentially setting up knight f4 ideas. We're thinking of bishop c1 once the king gets there. Yeah, so knight f4 is a potential idea, but the best part here for white is that you are still not showing your intentions. And for black to sort of expect your move, that's kind of difficult. But again, hindsight 2020, rook h8 would make a lot of sense, sort of discouraging Alireza from opening up the position. Now, you do not want to sacrifice a pawn because that just gives yourself too many problems. I think a better way of defending is to stay passive but sort of discouraging. And that's why I kind of find rook h8 a better idea here. Anton Guijarro David could definitely sort of just press and push Alireza away. It's not that it necessarily stops the idea, as Alireza can prepare it with rook g1 and g4, but you may as well try if you really don't have like a direct say. And that's kind of the problem of these positions. You don't have a direct say of what white is going to do. You're just there waiting, which is very uncomfortable. So he went rook e8, sort of anticipating pressure on the e-pawn, but now Alireza goes for g4, and that might have came as a surprise. Takes, takes, now he goes rook h8, h5. So he's claiming a little bit more of space. I mean, you are putting some psychological pressure on your opponent. It's not that necessarily your position is winning, or even better, but the fact that they have to find some moves make it difficult. h5, knight f8, knight f4. And suddenly, Alireza went all in with the attack, and black is completely tied up. This rook cannot move anymore. It has a business to tend to. There's lots of pressure on e6, not to mention the fact that there is this beautiful idea of knight takes d5, f takes, rook takes e7, and white is just much better. Bishop d8, but all of these young kids and prodigies, they're very well aware of tactics. So mostly the way they were outplayed or were outplaying each other was positional play, and that's what Alireza does in this game. So already Alireza put a lot of pressure on, but it's still not yet winning. He is, of course, dominating, but there is some work to be done. So he goes rook h1, over defending the h-pawn, but like he isn't threatening anything specific yet, just consolidating. Rook g8, knight h4. And this is again, I mentioned earlier on that Esipenko is more of like the player who likes sort of being restrictive and solid. But in this game, Firouzja actually does the same thing. He isn't really going for like a straight up plan. He is just taking away and restricting whatever Anton Guijarro is trying to do. Anton Guijarro wanted to play g5. He made sure that there is knight h4 and you have a firm control over that square. Bishop c7, trying to exchange, but Firouzja goes, no, 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 no. No exchange for you. Knight d7, rook e1. And this is something that used to be called anaconda chess. You are slowly taking away the way of playing, exactly like a boa constrictor. Very much in the style of Gadakamsky. Gadakamsky also naturally tended to like playing this way. He's not showing his attentions, but he's slowly taking away all the play and oxygen from his opponent's plans. Again, like it's very difficult to move, and you never know as a defender whether you should lash out or just sit and wait. But the more you sit and wait, the stronger the grip gets by Alireza. Rook e8, and before we talked about the idea of exchanging the bishops, and we felt that it's good for black, but guess what? It's actually Alireza who gives and sort of offers the trade of bishops. Bishop takes, knight takes f4. But the fight still revolves around who gets to play e5, or if black will get to play e5 at all. So after takes, knight takes, again you don't have this idea of e5, because in that scenario, the d5 falls and you lose the game. So rook d6, king h3. Again, no rush, and sort of anticipates ideas such as knight e5 later on. Knight f8, knight g6, knight fg6. Pressing on that knight, potentially threatening that e6 square, and f4, f5 is incoming. And with these rooks sort of discoordinated, f4, e5, f4, f5 that is, very, very annoying and is very close to just winning straight up. Knight h7, f4. And it's coming closer. Rook d8. And again, Anton Guijarro seems to be trouble. Never quite there. Never just in time. Rook d8. He seems to be okay, but again, there pops in a new problem. So goes rook g1. Knight d6. And this is the moment it seems that, hey, he is going to get to e4, and then you're sort of struggling as white, because once you kind of cover the e6 pawn weakness, that knight on e4 might just become too powerful. However, now Firouzja does the old switcheroo. And I'm going to ask you, dear viewers, tell me, what is the old switcheroo that Alireza is hoping for in this position? We've been attacking the e6 pawn for like the past 20-25 moves. But now we're going to change our minds. Yep, you should go after the g pawn. Rook e g2. You're going after the g pawn. But it seems like, okay, like you go after the g pawn. What's the big deal? Rook g8. But when it comes to spectacular solutions, Alireza knows when to and how to do them. So the next move is going to be the game changer. Can you spot the game changer move? Yeah, indeed, Chet is saying there's just not enough space over for black to defend. In fact, if not for this move, it would have been actually possibly tenable for black, but this move just destroys black's defenses. Yeah, knight h8 is definitely an idea, but in that case, there is king f8, and still black can hold on. Barely, but can still hold on. But you are looking in the right direction. Knight h8 just doesn't work. It is a pretty cool move, but if you find knight h8, finding the other move will be a piece of cake. Yep, knight e7. And this is a brilliant move. Again, that h7 knight is just awful. And the king takes this rook g7. And that's the issue that you're facing. If king takes, there is this move. Takes, and you can pick up that knight on h7 with a winning position. And you just take it. Actually, you check first, and then you take it with a completely dominating position, which is just technically winning for Firouzja. But if they don't take, that's not really an option, because if you move the rook, then you just take here and like you sweep the board, takes, and rook g8 is just checkmates. So knight e7 looked like an idea that looks like just a cheapo, but it's a deadly cheapo at that. So knight e7. Here, Anton Guijarro tries knight g5, which is the last try, but already it's collapsing. Takes, king takes, check, king f7. Now he realizes that he has a lot of pressure on the g-pawn. And knight f3 and knight e5 will be the decisive moment. And how can we tell that white is just completely winning? Well, black has plenty of weaknesses on g7, e6, b6 and b5. Those are 4 weaknesses. That's a lot of weaknesses. Not to mention that white's pieces are just miles and miles away better than black's pieces on d8 and g8. Not to mention that this king on f7 is just in the way. Talking about being in the way, there's knight f3. Knight e5 is coming. Knight g5 is a threat. And there's just too many threats to handle. And this is just winning. Exactly. The difference between a cheapo and winning is whether there's an escape square. Yeah, but here there was no escape squares for Anton Guijarro. Rook f8. Oh, rook df8. Knight e5 check. King e7. Takes, takes. Takes. King f6. h6. Rook h8. King g4. Takes, and when it seems like things are under control, it turns out it's not under control really, because the king is in deep trouble. Here, Firouzja won as Anton Guijarro David resigned, but if he would have moved the knight, there's rook f7 checkmate. And that goes to show that Alireza, going from a tactical player, he is sort of developing his positional chops, and he's getting closer and closer to becoming a universal player that we didn't expect him, like a couple of years ago, to see. And this position was maybe slightly better for him, but not at all winning. But like a boa constrictor, slowly, he take away all the oxygen from Anton Guijarro's position, and he managed to outplay his opponent. So this was, I think, a very, very interesting game. But I do want to take a quick look at the other game between Harikrishna and Donchenko. And for that, I do want to take a look from a specific position, starting over here, this position. So rook d8 was played by Donchenko, and we get this type of position which seems so cut and dry, yet it's so lively. Why is it so lively? Well, it has to do with all of these pawn weaknesses on d6, b6, and b7, and the same pawn weaknesses for white, excuse me. But apart from that, this bishop on c8 is just too passive, and oftentimes you're struggling to get that bishop out because of queen takes d6, and this bishop is just stronger in general. So here white goes a4, stopping any rook a4 ideas, attacking the c4 pawn. So what really is going wrong in this position for black is the lack of space and the piece passivity, and they're just too passive. They can't hold the position together that well. Rook a5, rook b1, bishop d7. This is a typical g3 nimzo, in fact popularized by Kasparov himself. Now, I'm not saying that white is better. In fact, objectively, this is an even or balanced position, but you'll see that there are some tricks and ideas that black should have considered. Rook b4, bishop c6, solving this issue that we mentioned earlier on. Queen d4, takes, takes, rook c5. So black is actually consolidating. However, his pieces are still rather passive. The queen and rook are actually good, but this rook on d8 is still just basically a spectator. Whereas black's counterplay, mostly all along the c file and sometimes against this king. But that is all the compensation that black has, so black really has to be careful. Rook b1, Harikrishna, who is, by the way, one of the biggest talents of India and has been a big and important player of India for a long time by now. He is exerting some pressure on the b file. h6, queen d3. And I really like this move, queen d3, by Harikrishna. He is preparing the idea of taking on b6, But if he would have done so earlier on, there's rook c4 hitting the queen. So if he takes, then there's rook c4 immediately attacking the queen, and that's actually not that great. That's why he sort of goes queen d3 first, making sure that black cannot win time. Rook c6, and again it seems like there's nothing going on, but Harikrishna's next move is sort of awe-inspiring. So I am going to ask you to try to find this move, because it's sort of the key of White's concept. So far, White has trouble breaking through, because the black queen and rook is just building a fortress. But of course, here, White has this move of a5, and that will just break on through. Yes, it gives a better structure for black, but what Harikrishna is banking on is a strong piece play along the 7th rank with that rook. Queen c8, queen f3. Now again, if you consult the computer will scoff at this and say this is not enough, but just by a sample line of rook c7 losing on the spot, you'll understand that defending is not so easy. Because if you take, it's checkmate on g7. So even though White's pieces look a bit scattered and these pawns weak, but he does get a lot of play along the f file and the 7th. Rook f8, rook b8. So this rook is, by the way, untouchable, because if you touch it, then there's queen takes c6. Rook b8, queen d7, rook 1b7. And this is kind of the Harikrishna kind of way of playing. He goes for activity and hopes to use it to the max. Rook c7, takes, rook b8, and goes king e7. And in the upcoming moves, what will be very interesting, how both sides are going to be staunchly refusing any chances for a draw. So rook g8, queen c6, e4. Not interested in an endgame. He wants to attack, because with these heavy pieces and the king still in the middle, he believes he gets good attacking chances, and that is actually correct. It is still very much of a balanced position. g6, a solid move, but again, for us to understand how to play this, we've got to realize that this king on e7 is just bad. I said that earlier on. I just wanted to sort of reconfirm that. Queen e3. So Harikrishna immediately goes after the h-pawn, and if he could take it, he will get behind and outflanking that king with dangerous threats. g5, h4. He's saying, okay, if I can do those exchanges, that would be perfect. Queen c5, queen f3. No exchanges for you. Queen e5, takes, rook a8. So this is what we would call a dynamically balanced position. Black has a better structure, but a significantly worse king in the middle. Queen c5, queen h5. Still trying to get behind of that side of the board. Rook g8, queen e5, queen g4. a4, rook takes g5. And here I think the mistake occurred. He really should have taken this pawn on c3 and should have enough to hold. But for some reason or another, he might have felt that this a-pawn can make a run for it, and if you have a c3 and c4 pawns there, you'll never be able to go back with your queen via queen g7 and queen a1, or at least that's how I would try to make sense of Donchenko not actually taking c3. Queen f6. So this is a very dangerous situation for both sides. The pawn is rushing down to become a queen. But you can stop queening happening by checkmating. So with that, any ideas how we could get closer to this king on e7? Because right now that king on e7 is actually chilling. There's just too many pawns providing its shelter. But if we could sort of peel that away, white is going to be able to get some good play against the king. Well, if we can go rook h5, rook h1, but that's more defensive in nature, and what Harikrishna was doing all along is being very, very aggressive, going for the mate instead of defending. So it is just logical to follow that up in the same direction and same vein. So here in this position, Harikrishna played c5. He didn't play e5 because these pawns are actually useless. They're not really helping with the attack. Unlike this e pawn, because after c5, once they take, there'll be this extra option of e5, not only closing that diagonal, this diagonal for the queen, but also sort of boxing that king in and potentially setting up some very nice ideas. Rook takes c5, a3, e5. And this might have been something that Donchenko underestimated. He thought that he's just way too close to get a queen, but it really doesn't matter in this situation. That king is just way too exposed, and it's just not enough interaction between that rook and queen right now to hold it together. Queen h8, queen b4. Immediately going for that one, and rook c7 and rook c8 checks are just very powerful. Even if you go here, that's just not enough. Check, check, and you will get mated. So you don't have the luxury of just trying to run away with the queen. So queen a8 check, king h2, cool and calm. If you check again, I'd assume that white would just go king g1 and you run out of checks, and you still have to deal with rook c7 and rook c8. So king h2, king e8, but here comes the other problem. Rook b5, oh, wrong one, rook b5, rook b8 is coming there, and you just don't have enough defenders to stop yourself from losing material. Queen c6, it does help. It won't lose its queen, but Donchenko does lose the game, as after queen d4, white is going to pick up that rook. Therefore, Donchenko resigned. So really what we've learned from these Tata Steel endgames is that the more weaknesses you get, the more targets you can find, the more likely you're going to win. Also, you really should be patient when you're trying to convert the smallest of advantages. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good night.